Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, this is Stuart Fay with LBMC. We're going to get the presentation going here in just a few minutes. We're going to give time for everybody to start logging in. Car, are you able to talk as well?
I am. Good afternoon, everybody. We're just going to give everybody another minute to log on and join the webinar. So thanks again for joining today. Okay. All right, Stuart, let's go ahead and get started. Today I'd like to welcome everyone to the Visa Level 4 Merchant Requirements for PCI DSS validation and QIR technician requirements that are effective at the end of this month. We're very excited to have Stuart Fay with us today. He is a qualified security assessor, and he's technically with LBMC Security. Just a couple of housekeeping items is that everyone here is in listen-only mode, and we will have the presentation available to you after the conclusion of the webinar. There will be a short survey that you must complete, and then in a few days you will receive a copy of the presentation. And let's move on to the presenters. Oh, sorry. I guess we can go back to housekeeping. My apologies. Just wanted to also let everybody know that the webinar is being recorded and will be available on YouTube in approximately 30 days. And you can ask questions via the question panel, which is on your computer screen. If you have any questions, please feel free to email Conexxus at info@conexxus.org. Now we'll move on to the presenters. Our host today from Conexxus is Miss Allie Russell. And so Allie, thanks for getting us started today. We appreciate all your help and coordination. My name is Cara Gunderson. I'm the chair of the Data Security Committee for Conexxus, and I am the POS manager at Sitka Petroleum. And our most important guest today is Mr. Stuart Fay. Like I'd mentioned, he is a qualified security assessor with LBMC Security. Just a little bit about Conexxus, and like myself and Stuart, we are volunteers for Conexxus, and Conexxus is an independent nonprofit technology organization. We set standards for such things as data, security, mobile commerce, and like I mentioned, it's really driven by the volunteers and the industry experts that we have. Conexxus really provides vision for the emerging technology and trends. And Conexxus is also an advocate for our industry. A lot of folks might remember Conexxus as formerly known as PCATS, which is a division of NACS Technology. Next slide. Just a quick reminder that Stuart is going to talk to us today about the requirements that are coming up at the end of the month for PCI compliance. In February, we've got a great group of folks that are going to tell us how to comply with those requirements. And then in March, we have a SIM presentation. And then in April, we have another presentation of the Internet of Things and the impact of bringing your own device to the workplace. And then in May, we have customer engagement technologies to enhance sales and profitability. And if you do have any other webinar ideas or suggestions, please do let us know at info@conexxus.org. Next slide. Conexxus holds their annual conference every year in the spring. This year it's going to be in Annapolis, Maryland, April 23rd through the 27th. I would like to remind attendees that you must be a Conexxus member and that the early registration fees end as of tomorrow, January 20th. The fees go up on January 21st. So if you plan to register and plan to attend, please do so today or tomorrow before the fees go up. Next slide. So Stuart's going to review PCI compliance and then the new visa requirements and everything that's entailed along with that. So Stuart, I'm going to turn this over to you, and thanks again for your presentation and sharing your knowledge with us.
Sure. Thanks, Carl. Thanks, guys. Again, this is Stuart Fay with LBMC Security, and I'm excited to talk to you guys about some new things that are happening in the PCI space. As Carl said, I'm a QSA, and so I spend a lot of my time doing PCI work for clients, and there's always things that are going on and changing in it, and what's happening for the small merchants is no different. And so I'm going to go over kind of what's going on, and going to give a lot of chances at the end to if you guys ask questions, whether it's be about this program or if you guys just got general PCI questions, I'm happy to answer those at the end as well. So wanted to just start off by giving a just general overview of what PCI is. I'm assuming that most of the people on this webinar are associated with small merchants that might not be intimately familiar with PCI and its ins and outs. So quickly here go over a kind of just a brief overview what PCI is. So you might hear the term PCI, you might hear the term PCI DSS, you might even hear it referred to as that thing you got to do to protect your credit card data. From a industry standpoint, the term is really PCI DSS, and what that stands for is Payment Card Industry Data Security Standards. And that's really all that is just an industry, and that's the important word here, an industry security rules set up by the major card brands like Visa and MasterCard to help protect credit card information. Some brief history there is, prior to PCI regulations that came out, all the card brands had their own rules and regulations on what their merchants had to do to protect credit card data, and it was very confusing, and none of it was really enforced. And so they formed this PCI Council and PCI requirements to help with that. One interesting thing to note here is that PCI is not a law, unlike some other types of regulations like some of the healthcare laws like HIPAA, which is an actual law. There is no law for not being PCI compliant. No one's going to go to jail if you have a credit card breach, et cetera, from that perspective. Unlike, again, some of those other industries that there are some of those risks in extreme situations. So this regulation simply came about by the different card brands. So it's important to know who the PCI players are before you can understand and make sure that you're compliant and understand the rules and regulations. You've got to figure out who the players are. And so the first and the most important player here are the payment brands. The major payment brands, Visa, American Express, Visa, et cetera. Those are the payment brands. They define the compliance programs, and they also enforce the rules and regulations. They also are the ones who would assess fines and penalties for any non-compliance. And I'll talk about a little bit how that would work in just a minute. But they're kind of at the top of the food chain when it comes to PCI. The next player is the PCI Security Standards Council. This council is the one that maintains the rules that everyone has to follow for PCI, right? The PCI requirements list. And the PCI Council was formed by, and it is an independent body, but it was formed originally by the major card brands. They basically said, hey, we're going to form this separate group that we're going to give responsibility to make the rules and manage our program for us. And so that's what the PCI Security Council does. They're also the ones that certify auditors to go do assessments. They maintain, the communication and the website on filling out the FAQs and keeping up with who's compliant and who's not from an assessor standpoint. The next player in the PCI space would be what's called an acquirer. You'll also hear the term merchant bank. You might even hear the term payment processor. So that's basically who you as a merchant have a relationship with to get your money. And so they are tasked to keeping all of their customers compliant. And so the way that works is Visa and MasterCard, they dictate things down to these merchant banks or acquirers, and then those merchant banks and acquirers who have a direct relationship with the merchant, with you guys, would then basically filter down that information to them. They'd be the ones who would tell you that you need to be PCI compliant. They'd be the ones who would tell you that you need to fill out a form, an FAQ form, or that you need to do a full audit or the like. In this space, another important PCI player is the oil brands. Now, depending on your situation, you may have a relationship with one of the oil brands or not. I'm going to kind of talk generically here, given the various situations, and I'm going to let Cara interject as well if she wants to here. But you more than likely, if you are a C-store operator and have got Shell or Exxon or whoever it might be on your flag, you've got some type of contractual relationship with them to be PCI compliant, more than likely, and there's probably other contractual obligations that you have with them. As you're aware, most oil brands do have direct relationships with different acquirers and different point-of-sale vendors. A lot of times, they're the ones who are dictating what type of point-of-sale systems to use and are giving guidance to their members for PCI. Cara, was there anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, I think you did a pretty good job explaining it. So yeah, so the chain of command typically goes, the oil brands, like you said, have the relationship with the acquirers, and then those that have that particular brand have the relationship with the oil brand. So that is sort of the chain of command there from a PCI perspective. So it is really important to check with the oil brands, as Stuart will talk about later, where your responsibilities lie and who's responsible for what. So, but he'll get into that in just a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one more thing to note there is that, again, through those contractual relationships, there are more than likely fines and fees that a C-store operator has agreed to pay for non-compliance and those type of things. And again, that's all dictated, and all is, basically the difference between you and the oil brands. I got a question on here. What's a C-store, convenience store? Petrol station, so apologize if that's not a term that you've heard. I'll try to use a different term. But a C-store is, in my book, just it's a short for convenience store location. Cara, is that a correct association with?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
yes, sir.
Great. All right. So the final player that I wanted to talk about today is the merchant. Again, I'm using the term C-store operator here. And again, this presentation is very heavily focused on the oil and gas industry, and so a lot of the terms are going to be related to that. But the merchants and service providers are the ones that are actually taking a credit card from a customer, or the entity that is actually processing or storing a credit card data in some way. And the PCI rule says all those organizations have to comply with the PCI regulations. And so that's kind of where the rubber meets the road in terms of who has to do what. So what does PCI protect? So we've got this regulation. What exactly are we trying to protect here? Hopefully it's pretty obvious to everyone, but the credit card number is really what is the most important piece of protection here. And so when we say credit card number, that's kind of a generic term here, but what that really boils down to is the full contents of the magnetic stripe or the chip that you are that a customer has, right? So that full magnetic stripe has got more data on it than just the credit card number itself. And so all that data needs to be protected. The primary account number or the credit card number, it's also referred to as the PAN. That's important to protect. The cardholder's name, that 4-digit or 3-digit security code on the back of the card is an important piece of data that needs to be protected, as well as the expiration date. And if you know, it's really Go ahead.
I'm sorry. So, but one other thing too is that sometimes now we're hearing about loyalty information getting stolen. And so some of the PCI regulations actually say sensitive data, even in addition to the card number. Is that a...
So the sensitive data they are referring to is additional proprietary information that a bank might add onto the mag stripe. Currently, there is no, various, non-sensitive data that applies is really not in scope for PCI, right? If it can't be used to, steal money, then it's really not in scope for PCI DSS.
Thank you.
Sure. So all these things that basically are the data that a bad guy would need to create a fraudulent transaction with your credit card, and that's really the bottom line there. PCI does allow you to save or retain certain parts of the credit card data, but not other parts, and that's kind of beyond the scope of this talk. But there are things that you actually can save and store per PCI, and others that don't. Again, in the world of convenience stores and gas stations, most locations are not storing credit card data at all, and so that's probably not a concern to most people on this call.
Yeah, the only exception to that would be as if they're imprinting manual on the manual imprinter. Like if a card doesn't work, then they're manually imprinting that card.
Correct. Yeah, there's a whole set of things about PCI that would apply, and in the webinar next month we'll go a little bit more details on those types of situations here. So real quick on an overview, because again, PCI can be very complicated and can be very confusing. And the goal I had here was just to give you guys a general overview, so they're all kind of on a level playing field when we start talking about what these new regulations are and what's going on here come January 31st. But simply put, PCI data security standards are technical and operational requirements that the payment card industry has set to help protect credit card data. The way they've got them organized into 12 high-level areas. You've got things like physical security and protecting the card data, and account management for computer systems, and it goes on to 12 different high-level areas. Within those 12 high-level areas, those 12 high-level requirements, there are very specific individual requirements that are expected to be in place, and there's 330 plus of them. So as you can see, that's a lot of detail. There's a lot of things that has to happen for a company to say that they're PCI compliant. Another aspect of being PCI compliant is that compliance is a all or nothing thing. You have to meet 100% of the requirements to say you're compliant, or you basically have to say you're non-compliant. So for example, if you filled out your self-assessment questionnaire and you had to say, no, we don't have just one of the items in place, at the end of that document, you would have to say that you're non-compliant. And so that's a departure from a lot of other types of audits and assessments where there's grading in there, and there's some shades of compliance or not. PCI does not have that. It's either you have it all in place or you say you're non-compliant. Now, there are some aspects of PCI that have some wiggle room there. PCI has this concept of a compensating control. And so what that is when you can't meet a certain PCI control normally for good reasons, you have the ability to come up with a different control that would reduce the risk in a different way. And that would be documented as part of your self-assessment questionnaire, as part of your IT security organization. So who has to comply with PCI? So any merchant or service provider who stores, transmits, or processes credit card data must comply with all requirements. one of the misnomers out there is that if you're a merchant, especially a small merchant, and that you outsource your PCI requirement, some of your PCI things to other people, that you're off the hook. That is not the case. The PCI Council makes it very clear that you cannot outsource your PCI compliance responsibility totally. What you can outsource is partial responsibility and operational responsibility, but at the end of the day, if you are the one who is processing that credit card through to to your bank, to your acquirer or your payment processor, it is your responsibility to for PCI compliance. Now that might be simply ensuring that whoever you hire to do PCI or to do your credit card processing is PCI compliant, but at the end of the day, the buck still stops with you, the merchant. Another thing that, again, is very confusing with PCI is the concept of being PCI compliant and having to report on compliance. And those are two very different things. So it is expected today that you as a merchant, or if you're a service provider, that you're PCI compliant today. And PCI has been around for a long time. Regardless if you're a level 4, regardless if you have never been asked to prove compliance, the expectation is, based on the contractual documents that you've signed with your bank, expect you to be PCI compliant already. The nuance and the caveats here is having to report compliance, and we're going to talk about a little bit about that in a little bit. But that's really the difference. Is everyone has to be PCI compliant regardless. Some of the differences on some of these programs that we're going to talk about is, do I have to do the effort to actually report that or not? And again, we'll talk about that in a minute. So let's go into the PCI QIR program. And when I hear of a QIR program, I immediately think of QR codes. This is not different things here. The PCI QIR program has nothing to do with QR codes. I kind of put this in there as just kind of tongue-in-cheek. What the PCI QIR program is a, well, first of all, it stands for, QIR stands for Qualified Integrators and Resellers. And what that is the PCI Council had recognized a number of years ago that there had been a number of breaches specifically associated with smaller merchants due to insecurities in particularly remote access software and technology that third parties were setting up to help manage point-of-sale systems at remote locations. And again, typically this is a company that would go out, they'd set up your point-of-sale system for you on your behalf, and you would be contracted with them to help support it, and so they needed a way to get back into your systems, so they'd set up some type of remote access and wouldn't do that securely. So a couple years ago, PCI said, you know what, we're going to have this program that basically trains these integrators and resellers to do that securely. And so that's what the QIR program is. And it started with very little fanfare a couple of years ago, and didn't get a whole lot of traction at first. There was no requirement to have to do this. It was an optional thing, one of those best practices that that came about. Well, what has happened is that the bad guys still keep on getting in the same way, and so that's really what started the program, this enforcement that's going to happen on January 31st, is that the requirement is now that you as a small merchant must use one of these QIRs. And that's good lead into this next slide here. So that's the new requirement. So what Visa has said is, as of January 31st of this year, all level 4 merchants must use a PCI certified QIR for any point-of-sale application and terminal installs, integrations, and maintenance of those. In addition to that, they said on that same date that all level 4 merchants must annually validate PCI DSS compliance or participate in what they're calling the TIP program, and that's also a new and a fairly big change from prior guidance where it was optional and kind of at the discretion of your merchant bank / acquirer on whether you had to validate compliance or not. And so what this is saying is that no, everyone has to validate compliance. Again, the key wording here to remember is to validate compliant. The expectation is that you're already compliant, that you're already abiding by PCI. This new requirement is only saying you now have to specifically report to us that you're compliant or not compliant.
So you can't. So in other words, you always have to be compliant even if you are in the TIP program.
Correct.
The difference is the validation. Got it. Thanks.
All right. There's some good questions coming in. We'll look at those here at the end. Next slide here. So, who does this apply to? Who does this new edict apply to? And so Visa says that it applies to level 4 merchants in the U.S. and Canada. And I don't think we've got too many members that are international, but Visa specifically have got this set to for U.S. and Canadian businesses only, mainly because that's where the fraud seems to be happening the most, according to kind of to their bulletin. A level 4 merchant is generally a small merchant. You're generally going to process less than, or the requirements for a level 4 merchant is you process less than 20,000 Visa or MasterCard e-commerce transactions. And really anybody that processes up to 1 million Visa transactions a year, so if you get 1 million card swipes, that's up to that is a level 4 merchant. So it's still quite a lot of transactions to be level 4. So it encompasses a very large number of organizations and businesses out there. One of the questions I get a lot from companies when we do our PCI assessments is, does it matter what the volume is? Do it matter if we have like really expensive volumes or not, or transaction dollar amounts? And PCI, in terms of its levels, has nothing to do with the dollar amount. It's purely a transactional base. And the reason there is that, again, PCI risk is really associated with numbers, right? So if a card breach happens on one credit card that has got a credit limit of $1 million, to Visa and MasterCard, that's relatively low risk, right? So just one card. But if there's a breach of 1 million individual credit cards, that's a much more significant event. So that's the logic there. What I always tell people in terms of how do I know if I'm a level 4 merchant or not? Nobody's ever told me, or how do I figure that out? Really, at the end of the day, your acquirer or bank, if you have a direct relationship with one, will tell you what your level is. That's really where the rubber meets the road. If they have the discretion of assigning you any specific merchant level. So they might tell you, you know what, we think you have more risk than another one of our customers, and so we're going to assign you to level 1, which means you have to do a much more extensive audit. And so it's really up to your merchant, your bank or acquirer for that. Oil brands are in the same way. If your relationship with credit card processing goes through one of the big oil brands, they should be communicating with you what their expectations are. Cara, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think in most cases, since we've got like 59% or a large percentage of our C-stores are single C-store operators, that the large majority of the oil branded, or the folks that are franchised through the oil brands, are going to be level 4s. But again, if you're uncertain, please do check with your oil brand.
Yeah, absolutely. So how can a small merchant comply, right? There's a lot going on. Credit card security, PCI, these are not my full-time jobs. This is not even a sliver of my full-time job. Really, for this new edict that's coming out about using the QIR, and by the way, if you do your point-of-sale setups and management in-house, this requirement does not say you're forced to go out and hire somebody to do it. I failed to mention that earlier. Really, this only applies if you are already using a third party to do that management. In I think most cases, most people do. That you want to hire a certified QIR company. But if you are doing these in-house or your bank manages it for you, then you don't have to hire a different company or hire a company altogether to do that. And so simply put, again, if you got a third party out there that are managing it for you, you must ensure that they are listed on the PCI Council's website for approved QIR companies. And if they're not on that list, you really have two choices. You hire another company, or you put strong pressure on the company you have to get certified. So what if I don't want to do this? I forget about it. It's we forget. You as a company are subject to non-compliance fines. Those fines are really going to be up to your acquirer. They're again the ones that assess fines and penalties for PCI. The likelihood that you get penalized for not doing this is it's kind of really undetermined at this point. Again, this is a new requirement. Traditionally, in our experience, it's they're going to give a very long grace period before they really start assigning serious fines and penalties. A lot of acquirers will fairly soon start enforcing some fairly minor penalties associated with their transactions, but it's really going to be determined. Again, every acquirer / merchant bank really has the ability to do their own thing here, so it really behooves you to go ahead and get compliant regardless. One good news in here, just in terms of timing, is that Visa has announced that they themselves are not going to enforce this compliance regulation against individual merchants. What they did say they're going to do is they are going to start asking the acquirers if they've done what they need to done. So Visa indirectly is going to start asking that you as a merchant are compliant, but they're not directly going to be enforcing this themselves and doing audits and making sure that that's happening. All right, next slide here. The second part of this new Visa edict is that level 4 merchants must annually validate PCI compliance. And again, this is a new compliance. I talked about it a bit before. So again, in the past, if you were a level 4 merchant, it was an optional thing for you to prove compliance. And the way that's done for a level 4 merchant is to fill out a self-assessment questionnaire, commonly in the industry called an SAQ. There are multiple different types of SAQs out there depending on what type of credit card transactions you do, and there's a lot of confusion on what they mean. I'm an SAQ A, I'm an SAQ D, and I want to be a A and I don't want to be a D. Your PCI compliance obligations does not change based on what SAQ you are allowed to fill out. What really the difference in the SAQ is that to fill out one SAQ over the other, you're asked a series of questions on what applies to you. Do I do e-commerce transactions? Do I do this? Do I do that? And based on those answers, the PCI Council or your acquirer will point you to an SAQ to fill out. Really all that's happening there is that based on how you've answered that question, they've gone ahead and made some of the requirements NA, because they know if you aren't doing e-commerce, well then the things associated with e-commerce aren't going to apply to you. And so instead of you seeing all those in there and just put NA in the report, they just remove them from certain FAQs to make it easier for you. So no, you're not getting away with anything by using one or the other. You're gonna have to be compliant with all of the requirements that apply to you regardless. But that's how you do. So an FAQ, and at the end of the FAQ, there's a section called the AOC, or Attestation of Compliance, and that's basically where you're signing off as a company saying, yes, we filled out this form accurately and we're compliant or not. And that's expected to be done every single year. Every merchant and every acquirer and merchant bank has a slightly different process on how that works. Some of them have got a web portal for you to log into to do it. Some of them have you do it on your own. It really is, your mileage will definitely vary there. So it will be hard for me to tell you exactly how it's going to work for you on this call. The other thing that is now expected to happen for every level 4 merchant is that every quarter you should be conducting a quarterly external vulnerability scan done by an approved scanning vendor. And again, the industry, they generally refer to that as an ASV vendor. And what that is that's a vendor online that you go out and then you put all your public IP addresses in, and it does a vulnerability scan, and you get a report back saying you either passed or you didn't pass from a security standpoint. The expectation is every quarter you're doing one of these external vulnerability scans, and you're submitting that evidence to your merchant bank / acquirer for validation.
Stuart, one of the confusion points I think with the self-assessment questionnaires that's out there is one of them talks about internet sales, and then I think a lot of folks get that confused with the fact that they're transmitting over the internet versus actually conducting sales on the internet. And so just wanted to kind of put that out there that just please, when you're reading the instructions for the self-assessment questionnaires, there is often a misconception or some confusion about which one to use. And I think for petroleum, the most common one is SAQD, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's a great point. Internet sales is really e-commerce is really what they're referring to. If you just send your data over the internet, which pretty much everybody does, that's not the same thing as internet sales. And you're also correct. And my understanding is, again, most petroleum convenience store type locations do fall in that SAQD category, and that is the full set of requirements. SAQD is a full set of requirements for compliance. And again, if you filled out another FAQ, again, you're not, and if you qualified for that, you're not getting away with anything. It just means that your setup does not, some of the information is not applicable, and they've just removed it for you. All right, next slide. So we talked about this before just a little bit, but do I have to validate PCI compliance? And the short answer is yes. This new requirement does say that all level 4 merchants must now validate PCI compliance. Again, validate compliance. Being PCI compliant is already assumed. They did have a caveat in the new requirement that says if you are a member of Visa's TIP program, you can be excluded from your annual compliance validation requirements. Again, the validation requirements there. Unfortunately for this particular industry, that's going to be really, if not impossible to do. We'll talk about that in just a second here. Well, actually, let's talk about it now real quick. The TIP program has got a couple of, actually, let me figure out where we are on here. I'm going to skip over this. I covered that. Yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself here. So in terms of being compliant, I'm going to talk about the TIP program in just a minute. So I'm getting a little out of order on my slides here. But where do you start in terms of being compliant and doing a QIR? Again, it really all boils down to your acquirer or your bank, and in some cases your oil brand will tell you what you need to do. That's really where the rubber meets the road. Communication should be given to you from one of those entities on what your next steps are. What happens a lot, though, in our experience as a company, is that there are a lot of companies that have never heard anything from their acquirer or bank PCI compliance before. And so the assumption is I'm off the hook. And so while if that's the case for you right now, you might have lucked out and not have to gone through some of the hoops that some other companies had. At any point, you could be asked for that information. And again, the expectation would be that you're compliant today. Also, if you had a breach today, and even if nobody told you how to be PCI compliant, again, in your contract somewhere, you're already expected to be there. So there'd be fines and penalties and repercussions on a breach, even if nobody told you to report on your PCI compliance. Another great place for small businesses, and really all businesses, to go for information on PCI compliance is the PCI Council's website, and I've got that listed down here. It's got an incredible amount of information on it. It's got a specific section for small businesses that is also really helpful and kind of helps explain things in a little bit more plain manner than some of the other sections of the website. Now let's talk about the TIP program. So the TIP program stands for Technology Innovation Program. It really is just a program that Visa set up to encourage merchants to pursue either EMV or point-to-point solutions. I hinted before that it's really difficult for merchants in this industry to qualify for it because, as I'm sure you guys are aware, EMV is not widely available at the pump, and neither is point-to-point solutions that are validated point-to-point solutions. So those are the two requirements that Visa has to have in place to meet the TIP program. And again, most C-stores and oil and gas locations are going to have a hard time doing that. They want, to qualify, Visa wants 75% of all your transactions to originate either through an EMV-capable card reader. They don't actually have to be an EMV card, but your card readers, 75% of your card readers have to be EMV-capable, or you have to have a validated point-to-point solution in place for PCI-validated point-to-point solution in place for your transactions. The other thing you have to have in place is you have to confirm that you don't have sensitive authentication data is not stored. And so that point is a little confusing. When PCI says sensitive authentication data, they don't mean the credit card number itself. You can still store the credit card number. What they want you not to store is the CVV number or that full magstripe data. That's the data they refer to as the sensitive authentication data. And then I've got a website here that you can go to for more information specifically on Visa's TIP program. Cara, was there anything that you wanted to add to that?
No, I think you did a pretty good job. Thanks.
Okay. So again, I mentioned the PCI Council's website's got a really good section for small businesses, those level 4 merchants. They've got two great short videos. These are 2 minutes each, that talk about both point-to-point encryption solutions as well as EMV. And I wanted to play them for you guys today. Again, 2 minutes each, really well done. Acknowledging that these solutions are difficult, if not impossible, to implement in this particular this oil and gas industry right now, but as things change, which they will, these will become more commonplace, and I want to have you guys just be more aware of kind of what they are. So I'm gonna play them, and hopefully the sound will play. Actually, all right, I'm gonna try the sound here. 1 second.
You're a merchant and you know your stuff, right? So what's wrong with this picture? Cardholder data that is stored, processed or transmitted in clear text is not protected and is at risk of being stolen by hackers. And we don't have to tell you what it means for your business if there's a breach, right? Merchants can protect cardholder data from hackers by using strong encryption to make sure that data can't be used by data thieves. In setting up this encryption protection, you are not only securing the data, you are saving time and money by reducing the overall effort spent on ensuring your PCI compliance. So, let's take a look. Point-to-point encryption, or P2PE, protects cardholder data from when a merchant accepts the payment card to the point it's handed off for processing. A P2PE solution contains 3 parts: validated hardware, validated software, and a validated solution provider. Similar to mobile, the PCI SSC does all the work with validation. So, all you need to do is check with your acquirer or payment service provider on their preferred P2PE solutions and providers. The P2PE solution provider has responsibility for creating a solution that will protect your customer's cardholder data and reduce your risk, and the P2PE solution can offer scope reduction and provide secure support of your overall PCI project. Since the merchant systems in a P2PE scenario cannot access encrypted cardholder data, those systems are excluded from the scope of a PCI DSS assessment. This reduces the cost of your PCI efforts. Now, P2PE does not eliminate all risk to cardholder data, but it does protect data stored and transmitted by a merchant. So, merchants using a P2PE solution must still comply with the PCI data security standards. There, that wasn't so hard now, was it? For more information, check out our quick resources at PCISecurityStandards.org.
All right. Cara, did that come across in terms of the voice?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Good. All right, so here's one more on EMV, and then I'm going to, due to time, I'm going to maybe skip over some of the stuff on 3.2, but here's this next one, just again 2 minutes.
It's a no-brainer. Lost or stolen payment cards can lead to fraud and lost revenue, and it's no secret that criminals can duplicate cardholder data from a magnetic strip onto counterfeit payment cards. So when the merchants process magnetic stripe-based cards or accept transactions via mail, phone, or the internet without PCI protections, those transactions are at risk. And we know you want to protect your customers and your business, right? There is a solution to help address this risk. To tell you more about it, let's turn over to a presenter who really knows her stuff. Please give a big round of applause for Penelope Payment.
Thank you. Oh, you're too kind. Let's get to it, shall we? Chip-based cards can help to reduce card-present fraud. A computer chip is embedded in the card, and this chip digitally signs the transaction to authenticate the card before the bank completes the transaction. EMV. You've heard that term bandied about, right? EMV, or EuroPay, MasterCard, Visa, was established in 1996. Chip cards use a specification from EMV. More than 1.5 billion chip-based cards were in use globally as of mid-2012, most in Europe and Southeast Asia, and the US plan and progress are underway. General US adoption is anticipated for 2016-2017. Okay, let's talk a little tech. These chip cards require merchants to use EMV-approved processing equipment, but this equipment does not protect transactions with magnetic strip-based cards. So it's a good time to remind everyone that even if you have EMV, you still need PCI. Together, they are a powerful combination to make you more secure. Because it focuses on protecting overall data security, the PCI DSS is especially important during the gradual global adoption of chip cards. So, in this era of internet shopping, the DSS will continue to provide comprehensive controls, ensuring the security of cardholder data in all environments. That's EMV in a nutshell. For more information, check out our quick resources at PCISecurityStandards.org.
All right, guys. Hopefully those two short videos were educational for you. I thought they were very well done. Again, they come directly from the PCI Council's website, and I think you can view them and other ones actually on the PCI Council's YouTube site. So we've only got about 10 minutes left. I wanted to answer questions people might have had. The last thing I wanted to talk about was just real briefly, I wanted to remind people that there's a brand new version of the PCI data security standard out there. It's called version 3.2, and it's got some fairly big requirements in it that are big changes that won't take effect for another year, but you should be on your radar. And the biggest one is multi-factor authentication for all access to computer systems as an administrator. So as we mentioned before, that Visa had said that a lot of breaches were happening because of remote access to point-of-sale systems. Those systems already had been required to use multi-factor authentication, and that means something just other than username and password. Sometimes that's a token, and there's other things associated with multi-factor authentication. we don't have the time to go into those, but the new requirement is that all access, whether even if you're on the same computer system, as long as it's remote access, it has to be two-factor authentication. And that's a big deal. And a lot of organizations need some planning to implement. The other thing, the last thing I wanted to implement is your merchant service provider relationship. There's a lot of confusion on if I've hired somebody to manage my firewall, if I've hired somebody to manage my point of sale system, to do my credit card transactions, that I'm off the hook for PCI. And what the PCI Council and Visa and MasterCard have determined is that there's a lot of, blaming the other person or assuming the other person is doing the security that needs to happen. And so there's a relatively new requirement that basically ensures that each player, both the merchant and a service provider, is clear and clearly communicates to the other person on what each other's responsibility is or what the expectation is. And so what I can tell you guys is if you guys have got vendors that you are assuming are doing parts of your security for PCI, that you very clearly ask them and communicate to them on what those expectations are. And what you might find is that there are some big holes on what you think they're doing and what they think they're doing. And so that's a big part of what some of the risks are today with credit card and the breaches and hacks and whatnot.
And of course, we suggest getting that in writing because
yes,
that's part
definitely.
of the regs. Yep.
Definitely. So that's all I had, and wanted to open it up to questions here.
Okay, great. Stuart, thank you very, very much. Lots of great content. And as Stuart had mentioned, there's going to be more information on PCI compliance and how to get there on the next webinar, next month's webinar. But so let's start with the questions that have come in so far. And again, on the panel on your screen, the webinar panel, there's a question section. So that's where we're going to be reading our questions from. So the first question that we have is, are EBT machines, basically the standalone terminals behind the counter, considered a PCI compliance risk? And so, the little standalone terminals that you would see like on the back counter at a convenience store or like at your dry cleaners, that type of thing. And so what we do know is that if it's transmitting over the internet, the first requirement is to install and maintain a firewall. And so for your sites that are transmitting over the internet, they do require a firewall. So in that case, it would be in scope.
So yeah, so in terms of risk, standalone terminals are the lowest risk that are out there. And so if you're still using a dial-up connection and a standalone credit card terminal, your PCI obligations are practically nothing. And, I'll use the word practically nothing because there are some things to do out there associated with them. But you've got the lowest risk out there. Frankly, you probably won't ever hear anything from anyone about proving compliance in that capacity. In fact, this QIR program specifically says that if you have got a non-internet connected, basically dial-up line point-of-sale terminal, that this new program does not apply to you.
Yeah.
So the risk of those,
yep.
Absolutely, that
yep.
need to be taken into consideration. Sure.
Yep. Great. Good question. So we have two questions that are very, very similar. So if a retailer is multi-branded, and so they've got so many stores with oil brand A, and so many stores with oil brand B, and so many stores with oil brand C, and maybe they're unbranded. Where do they fall, and what level of merchant, and how do they fall, and know what to validate and which level to validate at?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that really goes back to communicating with your various brands. Everyone's going to have a little bit different requirements there. The way PCI reporting works is by merchant ID, and so if I've got, if my brand A is with, Bank of America, my merchant ID is with Bank of America, then I've got brand B that, go through, Citibank. Well, each of those companies, each of those banks is responsible for ensuring that their credit card information is safe and secure, that you're PCI compliant. They technically do not care about credit card data that's going through another bank, right? Because that's not their responsibility. And so, in theory, each one of those could have their own, could have a different requirement, because there might be more credit card information going through one versus the other, and so there might be slightly different requirements there. And so there's some options that you potentially could have on how you would report compliance, but ultimately I would check with the oil brands on what they want to do, as well as your acquirer.
And it's based on transaction count, as you said before. It's not necessarily on the size or the dollar amount of the transaction. It's based on transaction counts. Correct? So
yeah, so we've got customers that, in this scenario, are level 1 for their unbranded locations, but are level 4 for others. And again, they've got some options on how they report things, and in some cases, it's easier for them to report everything as a level 1, so they do a full full audit for everything, and so they just have one report they give everybody, even though technically for their level 4 sites, it's overkill from a reporting standpoint. It's just easier for them, and so that's just an option that you have in those scenarios.
Right, and as you mentioned, I mean, there's definitely some physical elements for securing, as I talked about a couple times now, the manually imprinted credit card slips. I mean, those are things that they need to do. So, and as far as like your store network setup and knowing what comes in, if it's your tank monitoring, which is, or your video surveillance, all of those things. So it's important to know what your environment is.
Yeah.
So
next question I see on here. Yeah, go ahead.
The next question is, where do I find my particular, QSA or technician, and how do I find out if they're QIR certified?
Right.
And I think the answer to that is on the PCI website. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a section on the PCI website that lists qualified QIRs. There's lists of QSA companies, and there's lists of various things. But one of those lists that you can look up is certified QIR companies, and so you can search that list for who's on it.
Good. So next question is, you had mentioned earlier that if the merchant outsources services to a vendor, whether it's a single host or acquiring switch or a firewall provider or something similar that would have the ability to affect payments, the responsibility of the security of the card data is with the merchant. And is that, because that's what you enforced and emphasized before. Mm-hmm. But if they are a PCI DSS service provider, how does that all fit together?
Great question, and the responsibility is still with the merchant. Again, it's with the ultimate responsibility is with the owner of that merchant ID, the one who has a relationship with the bank, the one who's getting, when that person swipes the credit card number, where that money is, whose bank account it's going into. However, your responsibility could be as simple as ensuring that this other service provider is PCI compliant and that they're doing the PCI compliant things they're doing. And so that's the kind of the caveat that, really the hard work is the responsibility of the service provider in a case like this, but it's still your responsibility to ensure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, if that makes sense.
Yep, and in some cases you should be asking your service provider for their attestation of compliance, just so that you know that they have done their diligence and their PCI Absolutely. Compliance. And then, like you had mentioned earlier also about the making sure that you have a written agreement that you have a clear understanding of what your service providers are doing, as well as what they are providing for you. So when you read the Absolutely. PCI regs, it kind of says it both ways, right?
Sure, yeah.
So next question is, my acquirer charges a monthly fee for non-compliance on my monthly bill. Is that a fine?
You probably look at it as a fine. Fee, fine, same thing.
For not being compliant, exactly. And there's a specific question about SAQC. Does it require internal penetration testing?
I do not have SAQC memorized, so I won't be able to answer that. But if it's not in the if you download the SAQC document and it doesn't have something for requirement 11.2 or 11.3, then you don't.
Right.
If it's in there, you do. If it's not, you don't.
Right. You know, one of the other things that was in the Visa bulletin when they talked about the Level 4 merchant validation as well as the QIR certification was whether you are a franchised merchant or not, or even if you if you have an individually owned and operated location, even if you're under a corporation or you are a franchise, you are still required to do the validation. So, and then the last question that we have here is that if I qualify for the Visa TIP program, does that exclude me from validating PCI with the other card brands such as MasterCard, Amex, and Discover, and JCB?
That's a great question, and it's actually kind of a complicated question. And Mark, that's a good question here at the end. Visa and MasterCard generally have reciprocal agreements on what to do there, and so it doesn't make a lot of sense to only have to be compliant with one but not the other. And so again, it's really up to your acquirer to tell you what you can and cannot do there. But in my experience here is that you would not. Now, if you validate for the Visa TIP program, you would not. You would be, quote, okay for all the card brands. But you should, if that comes up in your environment, definitely ask your acquirer that same question, because they're the ones who gets to make that call.
Great. Well, I think that concludes our webinar for today. The questions have been answered, and again, you can find this on YouTube. If you have any questions, email Conexxus. Our next webinar is not technically scheduled yet, but I think we're leaning towards February 16th. And again, please fill out the questionnaire at the end if you'd like a copy of this, and this will also be posted on YouTube in about 30 days. So thank you, Stuart. Great information. Thank you for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us, and everybody have a great day.
All right, thanks everyone.